Good morning, Manos, and thank you so much for joining us on the In a Sense channel.
Good morning, Ian. Thank you for having me.
I've looked forward to this conversation for a long time. We've been in communication via email, and the topic we're talking about today is what I believe you've coined visceral politics. So I'm really, this channel is all about how we sense and interpret what's going on inside our body, and that includes our viscera. So I'm really keen to hear about how you're taking this topic into the realm of politics and decision making. So, but before we go on to that, please can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you ended up as Professor of Psychology at the Royal Holloway, University of London, as well as the Director at the Centre for Politics of Feelings?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, Ian, for having me. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about what we've been working on and what we think are the kind of future directions of research and the future challenges that we'll try to tackle. As you said, my name is Manos Tsakiris. Originally, I come from Greece, where I studied psychology as my first degree at the University of Social Sciences in Athens. And when I finished my first degree back in '99, I knew that I wanted to continue with my postgraduate studies. I was very much interested in philosophy at the time and a bit of structuralism and postmodernism. So I found an ideal master's course in London at King's College, jointly taught by the Institute of Psychiatry and the Department of Philosophy. And the title of the MSc course was Philosophy of Mental Disorder. So for me, that was very fascinating because it promised that it will bridge, two of my main passions, psychology and mental health and philosophy. So this is what I first did when I came to London, which didn't go according to plan because I realized that philosophy in UK is very different from continental philosophy, which is what I was used to back in Greece. So it was very much analytic philosophy, philosophy of language, and of course how it links to questions of classification of mental disorders and so on. But during that course, I picked up some very important threads that actually characterized the future career that I had. And I will say a bit more about that later on. One of the important things that I got from that master's was an understanding that we should study the brain. And I'm saying that because my first degree in Greece was very, very much focused on social psychology, clinical psychology. So I realized the importance of the brain. And when I finished my first master's, I did a second master's at UCL in cognitive neuropsychology. And following that, I met at UCL Patrick Haggard, who became my PhD supervisor. And I completed my PhD at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at UCL in 2006. The topic of my PhD was to try and understand the neural and cognitive mechanisms that underpin what I think is a very basic sense of selfhood, the feeling that this body belongs to you. So we call it the sense of body ownership. And a second related dimension, which is the sense of agency, the sense of controlling your own body to perform the actions that you want in the world. Soon after I finished my PhD, I did 1 year of postdoc at UCL, and then I moved to Royal Holloway in 2007 as a lecturer, where I created the Lab of Action and Body, also known as LAB, where we started investigating questions that had to do with the more social dimension of body ownership. And slowly we started drifting towards other dimensions of embodiment, namely interoception. So not so much how you perceive your body or yourself from the outside, but how you become aware of your body from within. And for many years, we have been tackling this kind of questions. And from 2016 onwards, and that was just before major sociopolitical events, and eventually the pandemic changed radically the way we experience ourselves, our social networks, our society and political life, I started tackling a bit broader questions in a more interdisciplinary approach, bringing insights from different disciplines that could be philosophy or art history or sociology, political science, to understand a little bit the more social role of embodiment when it comes to how we relate to other people, when it comes to relating to images and visual culture, and eventually when it comes to politics.
Wow. Thank you. So you're qualified from lots of different disciplines or lots of different areas of philosophy and science to kind of be researching in this area. And it was, in preparation for our meeting, I was watching one of your other interviews a few days ago, and it was you were talking about a lot about art and images in media and so on, and how they can affect us. So yeah, maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But first of all, do you have any recent examples of how awareness of your own internal bodily state influences day-to-day decisions and actions?
That's a very good and difficult question. It presupposes that there are decisions that we take that could be purely rational, and decisions that we take that could be purely driven by our affect emotions, that are basically the products of our bodily feelings. How does the world make me feel? Do I feel good or bad? And how this will guide my decisions. And thinking about decisions that have been predominantly, affect-based or reason-based, I'm not sure I can actually tell the difference. I don't think that there's any decision which is driven by one source only. There may be decisions that we take on the fly, who may be driven by our gut feelings, whether I should, talk to that person, or am I attracted to that other person? And, you don't know anything, but you just have some kind of intuition or some kind of undifferentiated affect. This is something that I want to approach. This is somebody that I want to avoid. But of course, you have prior experience about which you have thought, you can rationalize them, you have your reasons. So all decisions, I think, contain a blurring of these different ingredients. But for me, the most important thing, and it's one that has been neglected, even in the area of embodied cognition that I've been working on for many, many years. But thankfully, it's something that comes to the surface in the forefront at the moment, is that, okay, we're not rational beings. We're not purely rational, but what are we? And I think we are primarily relational beings. It is the relations with others that actually guide our decisions. Mm-hmm. So the reason why we're not rational is because we are relational. And when you think about relations, there's a lot of affect. And that begins from very early on in life. And I think it continues until our last breath. We're inherently social animals. No man or woman is an island. We do need the others. We live for the others. Others is hell, as Jean-Paul Sartre said, but at the same time, they're the ones that actually give meaning in life. So we're trying to navigate at the same time, the experience of one's own self, but we shouldn't think of that experience as being isolated or distinct from the experience of other people and the kind of relations we engage. So we can call that the second person neuroscience. It's neither that I'm studying just, a solitary subject, introspecting on my experiences. It's not the case that we just study a brain in a vat, but we try to understand what's going on between humans in the dyadic interactions or in larger groups and networks. So I think understanding how other people makes us feel, how we engage with other people, it is what will give us insights on how we feel, how we become aware of our own bodies.
So yeah, a relational perspective, and how you just finished that off by saying understanding how other people make us feel. That's and then we can use that topic as a kind of a very intimate sort of family, friends, and close level, but also, as you say, which I hope we talk about on a political level. It's at the end of the day, it is people interacting with people.
Yes.
So before we move on to the work of that you're doing on politics, can we take a little step back and just spend a bit more time on interoception in general? And I was moved to speak to you after talking with Professor Laura Cram, who's also been on this channel, and we were talking about interoceptive awareness and discernment. She's a yoga practitioner outside of her sort of university work. Now, the subtitle of a book that you edited with Helena de Presta is the book is called Interoceptive Mind, but the subtitle is From Homeostasis to Awareness. So for people who maybe aren't sort of familiar with the latest mechanistic understanding of homeostasis, interoception, how does homeostasis, which is this basic sort of drive to keep our body in a sort of equilibrium, steady state, how does that relate to our ability to sense and interpret bodily signals?
Mm-hmm. So, first of all, thanks for mentioning the book, which just came out on a paperback edition, which could be a bit more affordable. And I think, it's not because I did it with a very good colleague of mine, Elena de Prester, but I think it's a good introduction on interoception because it does bring perspectives from different disciplines. I think it's the first concentrated effort to have, neuroscientists, psychologists, philosophers talking about interoception. Now, just to take a step back, the very term interoception was coined by Sherrington in 1906, and he tried to distinguish interoceptors from other types of neurons that perceive events from the external world or events on the body, like proprioceptors, sensing, the position of your limbs in space. So interoceptors have to do with the perception of internal signals of the body. And of course, at the very basic physiological level, interoception is critical for process of homeostasis. In other words, ensuring that different variables of bodily function stay within a range of safe limits, safe for the viability of the organism and eventually the well-being. Now, a lot of these things happen by reflex automatically. So, when you sitting and you stand up, you have the barrel reflex and, the blood pressure will change, your heart rate will change. These have to be homeostatically regulated to make sure that you don't fall on the ground, that your blood pressure still is at the right kind of level for you to be able to stand up and so on. Your heart rate is constantly regulated by your prefrontal cortex that tries to put the brake, again, to try and keep it within safe limits. So a lot of these things just happen, they're on the background of every single moment of our lives. But at the same time, humans and probably some other non-human animals, we are capable of being aware of the world, but we're also aware of our own internal bodily milieu. And this is quite important for experiencing emotions, but also for coming into communication with others and telling them, what do I need? How do I feel? How do you make me feel? Now, for me, this is a fascinating question. On the one level, you have the physiology, where things are being regulated or sometimes dysregulated despite yourself. And at the same time, you have the capacity to become aware of how it feels. Now, where does the capacity come from and what is important for actually structuring our sense of self, our sense of who we are? Now, I have written together with Katerina Fotopoulou a target article called Mentalizing Homeostasis. And just for the record, that was Katerina's brilliant idea to put forward this framework. And I helped, to shape it up to the extent that I could. What is the idea behind mentalizing homeostasis and why interoception is so important? Now, think about newborns. Humans are part of what we would call the altricial species. Now, altricial animals are born in a very immature state and are unable to care for themselves. And it's quite obvious that, a newborn human wouldn't survive for many hours unless there was somebody who could actually take care of them. Now, think of the human newborn as a biological entity that is being bombarded by physiological signals. And they have a very limited behavioral repertoire. They cannot talk to you. They cannot say, this is what's going on, help me. They can just cry. And the cause of this crying could be different. So they can cry because they're in pain. They can cry because they're fussy. They can cry because they're hungry. They can cry because they're just tired, whatever. Now, they have a physiological need that gives rise to the crying, but they can do nothing about it. The motor system is immature. They cannot move. Thermoregulation is bad. They cannot regulate their temperature themselves. They cannot feed themselves. They cannot, turn on the television or eat chocolate for comfort. So they have to rely on the caretaker to actually provide the right kind of response to satisfy the homeostatic need. And this is where things become inherently social. And this is why we have been saying that even the awareness of one's own body, which is yours in a way that no other object in the world is actually given to you by others. So when the baby is crying, the baby needs to satisfy the homeostatic need. So it has to rely on the caretaker. And the caretaker is important here because if the baby is crying because the baby is in pain, but the caretaker is convinced that the baby is hungry and insists on feeding it, then two things will happen. The baby will get even more frustrated, and more importantly, the homeostatic need will not be satisfied. Now, think about this chain of events and this repetition and the building of associations between a particular sensation, my crying, and the kind of stimulus I get from the environment. In order to start giving a more or less accurate and confident model to the body about their own, to the baby about their own body, you need to have this kind of contingent response. In other words, what the caretaker needs to do, they need to do a bit of predictive coding. They need to understand what is the underlying cause of what the baby is displaying as behavior. And I think here now you start seeing what may be the basic developmental mechanism that actually drives the onset and the development and the quality of that body model that we have. An understanding of this, how I feel, and when I feel X, Y, or Z, this is what I need to get from the environment. This is the way in which I need to engage with the environment. So I think it's quite important to start with this idea that we start building a model of our own selves via the others, thanks to other people. And this quality that we have of how good or bad we can read out our bodily signals is something that will continue with us for the rest of our lives. Of course, there are other developmental stages where these processes become particularly important and perhaps also become more social. And I'm thinking about adolescence, thinking about the onset of puberty, where you have major changes happening both in the physiology of the body, the appearance of the body, the hormones, the maturation of different brain areas at different time frames, including limbic areas that have to do with the processing of affective states, including the prefrontal cortex, which has to do with the regulation of these affective states. And of course, the more social sense of self that adolescents start developing that goes beyond their immediate family, and they have friends and peer pressure and, start falling in and out of love and so on. And this is probably another critical period where interoception may be changing quite a lot, given that your body is also changing and the machinery that we have to become aware of our own bodies, i.e. the brain, is also changing, but also the social interaction we have from which we get feedback about how we feel and how we make other people feel also change.
That is fascinating. And, the way that you slowly walked us through that scenario of a newborn, which is unable to use words, or it can make sounds, but can't use words that we think we know the meaning of. So we have to anticipate or guess the meaning. And it's kind of an experimental phase for the parent and the child, I suppose, of figuring each other out. And then to say that really never stops throughout life. And it just reminded me actually of, the way that you talked about the physical appearance of others changing during adolescence, but also in old age as well. I'm thinking about this kind of the wise person and the elder, and with the recent passing of the Queen, it seems that her appearance symbolized lots of different things to different people. Mm-hmm. For some people she was the Queen, but for others she was a symbol of female, empowerment and what she achieved. For others she was, a grandmother figure, a frail person. So it's very interesting how we, what we see in others will stir up different things in us and guide our reactions and behavior, possibly even our behavior.
There is also a quite interesting point here that I want to make about, the Queen and the role that she played and her role in actually providing some kind of larger scale social allostasis. I mean, she's portrayed and she's viewed as a symbol of unity and providing a sense of continuity. And I think you can probably see it during this last week, the ways in which people talk about her role as somebody who regulates the affect and emotion of the people. And that was also the case following the death of Diana. What people were actually calling for the Queen to come and do is actually play that role of acknowledging what is the emotion and trying to say something and verbalize, mentalize, and regulate it. Of course, in the kind of limited way for many different reasons, have to do with the kind of norms and the role of monarchy. In very limited ways, she could say what she was actually thinking or feeling. But even the small, subtle bodily cues or few words that she would say would actually play that role of providing the means for an allostasis, for actually understanding what's going on, and a regulation of other people.
That is, yeah, that's very interesting. That she's the master kind of regulator of the nation's mood or emotions. And certainly after Princess Diana died, she did tend to show more emotion, I think, than before. Then she was the typical kind of stiff upper lip, British, stoic kind of figure, but did kind of soften. But as you said, also provided stability. So she didn't go completely kind of emotional roller coaster, but she provided a bit more warmth. So that is interesting. I haven't thought about it that way. But yeah, I heard the other day, following the Active Inference Institute, I don't know if you've seen them online, but they had a paper discussion on social communication as active inference, but they casted social communication as more of a control, which fits with what you're saying in terms of allostasis regulation, rather than communication just as the transfer of information. So I thought that's very interesting thing, that we don't just communicate to transmit information, it is to regulate each other.
Yes, and a lot of the information that we pick up is not actually explicitly communicated, but it is picked up nevertheless.
What do you mean by that?
You have different levels of communication, even in face-to-face interaction. So you have, the verbal communication, what can I explicitly say, and I have the micro movements in my facial expressions. I have my body posture, the affect that I can display. Even, things that are being processed completely unconsciously, like the odor, the smell, and so on. And this can actually influence decision-making. And quite often you may have very contradictory channels of communication happening at the same time. I may be saying something that seems very positive, but at the same time, my facial expression may be very negative. So which of the two do you decide to trust? What I'm actually saying, or what my, facial expression may be implying? And of course, which one is true for my experience as well, what I'm actually saying or what my body is telling you. So there are different types, different channels of communication. Of course, these active inferences run in parallel, and they're differently weighted depending on different factors, like the context, how well I know somebody, how my first impression of how trustworthy that person is will influence the discussion and so on.
And hopefully we'll talk about this when we get onto the visceral politics, but maybe even the time of day or how tired I am may change which cues I may be more, this is me talking personally now, I may, if 10 o'clock at night when I've had a full day work, I may be more sensitive to a tone of voice from someone around me, a family member, than I would first thing in the morning. And so I wouldn't be less necessarily paying attention to the content. It's more like the tone of voice or the body language I find becomes more important when I'm fatigued. So this idea of body awareness and paying attention to our internal state isn't new. It's been around in wisdom traditions and practices and therapies for a long time. And just pulling a quote, I think from one of your papers you were quoting, or one of your co-authors were quoting Merleau-Ponty from 1945, who wrote in the Phenomenology of Perception that the body is our general medium for having a world. What do you think is, so these ideas aren't new, but in recent years, what do you think are the most striking sort of pieces of evidence from modern science that help us appreciate the role of bodily processes in guiding our perceptions?
First of all, thanks for the note to Maurice Merleau-Ponty. I have to say here that it was the only book, The Phenomenology of Perception, that was next to me for the whole duration of my PhD. I think it was the inspiration for a lot of the experiments that I ended up doing in my PhD. And I think it's probably one of the most important books in philosophy written in the 20th century. He was a remarkable person who died, unfortunately, very young. But I think he has marked so much of the thinking that went on in experimental psychology cognitive neuroscience and social neuroscience. And of course, his book, The Phenomenology of Perception, is supposed to be about perception, but eventually it's about the experience of one's own body and how this very fact of embodiment actually is what gives us the world. Now, Merleau-Ponty focused primarily on what I would call the sensory motor body, your actions, your active bodily engagement with the world, how this changed the way you perceive things. And I think it has provided probably the springboard for a lot of the key developments in this area of embodied cognition. A lot of my colleagues who have been working on mirror neurons, the idea that when you observe an action, your brain simulates in similar brain structures what you actually see. And this is the means by which you understand what's going on. And even if the mirror neurons have come under a lot of criticism, I think there is a mirroring system in the brain that what we see on others is being mapped onto our own sensory motor system. I don't want to go into the discussion whether this is innate or learned by association. For me, this is an important question, but not so relevant for today's discussion. So when we interact with others, we use the same kind of machinery that we have for ourselves to perform actions and show facial expressions to understand other people. And I think for a few decades, the focus goes on that, on the sensory motor body and how we perceive bodies from the outside. One critical development that took place was this renewed interest in interoception. As I said, interoception as a term was introduced in 1906. Few papers mentioned the term for many decades. There was a golden era of interoceptive research in the Soviet Union in the decades of the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And then, it died out again. And in the early 2000s, you see a lot of interest accumulating, and that coincides with the publication of Antonio Damasio's seminal book, Descartes' Error, and then the feeling of what happens, the work of Bud Craig on the insula, and a few seminal studies by Hugo Critchley. So suddenly people start realizing, okay, beyond rationality and cognition, can we think about affect? If we start thinking about affect and emotion, where does it come from? It comes from the physiological engagement of our visceral body. We start developing ways in which we can study it. You have the emergence of functional neuroimaging. So Hugo Critchley is doing some neuroimaging studies showing that people's ability to become aware of their own internal states, such as the heartbeat, correlates with activity of the insula. By that time, we know that this part of the brain, the insula, which literally means an island, is viewed not as an island, but as a critical hub in the brain, which is very well connected to different brain areas. And it's probably the main hub of the brain for bringing together information that have to do with your own body. With your own body in the sense of, perceiving touch, but also integrating feelings of touch with interoceptive feelings of pleasure, displeasure, hunger, fatigue, and so on. And with more global representations of one's own self, what Bud Craig would call the material me. And we start understanding a little bit about people's capacity to become interoceptively aware. Some people are good, some people are not so good. We still don't know why some people end up being good or not so good. And that's one important future research challenge. And I think over the last decade or two, you have a tenfold increase in the number of papers looking at interoception at different levels. So you have some very elegant studies that look at interoception in non-human animals. And just to mention one very good example is a study that came last year out in Science. It was led by a young postdoc, Alexandra Klein, where they show in rats how the insular cortex integrates predictive sensory and interoceptive signals to provide then teaching signals that can actually gate our fear perceptions. So that study, a very elegant set of many experiments, illustrates how bodily feedback signals are constantly used by the brain to maintain fear and our fear response within a functional equilibrium. Now, then you have many studies that look at the impact of interoception on cognition. And just to give a few examples, you have a study by the lab of Catherine Talon-Baudry showing how the cortical representation of signals coming from the heart to the brain on every single heartbeat may actually predict whether people become aware of visual stimuli that are presented near the threshold of conscious awareness. You have the work of Micah Allen and colleagues from UCL showing, for example, how bodily arousal may actually regulate how precise we are in our perception and how confident we are about what we're seeing. You have work of Sarah Garfinkel and Hugo Critchley showing how signals from the heart influence the perception of emotion, but also more cognitive dimensions like memory. And in my lab, we have looked at how the quality of signals we have from within the body may shape the experience we have of our own body as an object that is being viewed by others. Just give an example. People know what body image actually is. It is the kind of mental representation that we have of how we look like. And we know that body image concerns are quite prevalent. You have young people, not just girls, but also boys, being very concerned about how they look. This may actually lead to very severe eating disorders or body image disorders. We live in a society that objectifies bodies in terms of thinking about our bodies, in terms of our well-being and health. Quite often we tend to think of our bodies in terms of their sexual appeal and appearance. And what we found in a series of studies was that the kind of awareness that people have of their internal body, how it feels like to be my body, is anti-correlated with their tendency to be dissatisfied about their body image and the tendency to objectify their bodies. In other words, people who are good enough in the awareness of how their body feels from within, they tend to be more satisfied about their body image, even if you control about their body mass index, and they tend to objectify themselves less. So I think there is a plethora of evidence coming from many different directions showing how important both the interoceptive signals and their awareness are for the experience of our own self, but also for a range of cognitive processes we are involved in. And just to say that I'm very optimistic about the future because we have a lot of talent in the field. You know, we have a lot of challenges in trying to develop new methods, but there are some very, very talented young colleagues, and I have great faith in them that they will actually drive the field forward. So people like Alexander Klein, Ezra, Mike Allen, Alexander Galvez-Ball, I think the future is bright for interoception, despite the challenges and quite often disagreements that exist within the community.
Yeah, I think I saw one of your papers on the challenges of measurement methods for measuring interoceptive awareness. Well, there's you've given a great set of different angles, which are all sort of measurements and perspectives, which are converging on how important interoception is. And you mentioned the early pioneers, Damasio, and still pioneers, Hugo Critchley. And I'm biased that I have a big interest in this topic, and I was pleased to see some other popular culture books come out this year. Antonio Damasio had one, but also Anil Seth's book on Being You, and one of the phrases in that was all of our perceptions are controlled hallucinations which happen with, through, and because of your living body. So, he's mentioning the importance of the body there. Do you think there's a shift occurring in the role that we give to mental functions in the brain? It used to be that the brain is kind of a master controller of to organize the body, but now it sounds more like the brain is in service of regulating the body. Would you say that outside of the field of interoception, there's this kind of shift in awareness, or is it just limited to the kind of embodiment, people who are interested in embodiment and interoception?
I like to think that there is a larger interest in these questions of embodiment and cognition and mental life that goes beyond, the group of researchers that are, of course, experts and interested in that field. And I think it would be interesting to reflect a bit on what are the broader social, historical reasons why this is the case. I think if you look also beyond psychology, neuroscience, we do observe an affective turn. This is a term coined by my friend and colleague Noga Arika in an article that she wrote. So you see that in different disciplines like history, historians, they focus a lot on the history of emotions. They try to understand emotions, not just some kind of effects of sociopolitical events, but causes of sociopolitical events. Of course, you see the importance of emotion in current discussion in political science. But also, I think the focus on embodiment is evident if you think about the emergence of the social neuroscience. Two of the people who wrote the social neuroscience textbook, the Oxford textbook on social neuroscience, were the late Cacioppo and Gary Berntson. And these are also the same people who wrote the textbook on psychophysiology, because they knew that measuring accurately peripheral signals from the body, like skin conductance and heart rate, will take us a long way in understanding how these signals may actually influence the way we process information, and more so in the kind of social context. So also the kind of development of methods that we have now allow us to do more interesting recordings from different sources at the same time, try to analyze these very rich data sets that we have in more interesting ways, and try to see, what is the coupling between the rhythms of the body and brain function. We have an understanding, or at least we have an interest now in thinking about the importance of the vagus nerve and how, our guts may have a second brain about which we know very little, even though, there are millions of neurons in our guts that communicate with our brain. So there is a whole continent or several different continents to be discovered because, I think the days of thinking of the brain as being in a vat or focusing on whatever is north of the neck, as Jerry Fodor once said, as being the important thing, I think these days are gone. I think there is an understanding which is widespread both in neuroscience, psychology, but also beyond our disciplines, that the body is very central. And there's another way in which the body comes to the forefront, and that links to technological advances, robotics, and AI, and the dreams or nightmares of AI. The idea of whether we can have artificial agents that would be capable of consciousness, that would be more human-like than human-unlike. And quite often, the interesting part there is, do these artificial agents or robots need to have a body, and what kind of body and body experience they should have in order to be sentient? So I think this kind of discussion will continue because the challenges will be quite interesting.
Certainly, yes, yeah. And if we have to make, in order to make a machine or a robot that can help us with complex tasks and have the flexibility and adaptability of a living being, we have to add more vulnerability into these and give them a body and add I think is it called soft robotics or something, this idea of a vulnerable, it's almost like we end up with a living organism, so why don't we just use living organisms in the first place? But we'll I guess we'll have to see where that ends up. So yeah, lots of exciting times ahead. And one other question I had was, I've been following the work of Professor Mark Solms, and in his book, The Hidden String, he states that consciousness is at its source affect. So he's sort of saying that, what I read from his work is that we become conscious of something when our body is saying it's important. Do you agree that it's this fundamental? And if so, what's the purpose of having mental or cognitive functions at all in relation to feelings?
I think that Mark is probably right, and Mark follows up on a long line of thinkers who thought in the same way about consciousness. So when I first came to London to do my master's in philosophy of mental disorder, I had to do a master's dissertation, and the topic that I chose was to look at the concept of affective consciousness and try to link three key thinkers: Damasio, Mark Solms, because at the time he had written an interesting article about affective consciousness, and Freud. Because Freud's original idea, and that was before he embarked onto psychoanalysis, when he was still a neurologist, was quite similar to the idea of Damasio and Mark Solms, that primarily consciousness is affective. And if you read the Project for Scientific Psychology, a brief paper written in 1995, that for many decades we thought it was lost, but eventually it reappeared. And is exactly the same kind of neural model of what Freud then wrote in the Interpretation of Dreams in 1900 as the mental model of the psyche. It's very clear that there is a common thread that goes from Freud's Project for Scientific Psychology, the Maslows idea about somatic markers, and Solm's role of affect. I agree that we are primarily affective embodied beings. I don't want to contrast that to our capacity for mental and cognitive functions. I don't see these as opposing forces. I think we are sufficiently complex as organisms and as social groups and societies that, of course, we do need to have these other cognitive capacities to mentalize our bodily signals, our feelings and affects, so that we can communicate with others, so that we can create, we can plan, we can play, we can take pleasure and give pleasure, but also, we're capable of inflicting pain and harm on others. And, it's a kind of complexity of our nervous system and of the kind of social structures, social networks that we require to actually sustain us in life, that all the rest follow from. And it is an interesting question of what would we be if we just had affect and probably awareness of affect without the rest of our cognitive capacities of learning, of remembering, of thinking, of communicating and planning. So I don't think that, it's one of the other things that the primary basis of consciousness is affective. But I see, as a cognitive capacity is building upon that mentalization of the affect and the more kind of complex computations that need to take place in order to fulfill the potential of a brain, that it is, sufficiently complex and creative to come up with things like, a poem or a painting, or, a complex social organization, a tradition of monarchy, or, the Holocaust and hate crime.
Yeah. Our ability to abstract and create images and express those. If we didn't have that, it would be very more basic, I guess. Impossible for me to try and imagine not having those abilities, I suppose. So I'm aware of the time, and we haven't got specifically onto the visceral politics as such. But how much time do you have?
I'm okay for 20-25 minutes more.
Okay. Brilliant, thank you. And so if we were to move on now to the realm of politics, I read a quote on your paper on visceral politics that the state or polity is an organic entity. So that sounds like an embodied view of human behavior, scaling up to the level of kind of some kind of social organization. So how does that view help us understand political behavior?
Yeah. So let me start by making reference to what is one of the most powerful metaphors that exist in political science and political philosophy. And most of the viewers would have heard the idea of the body politic. Now, the body politic is a polity, a city, a realm, or a state, and it's considered metaphorical as a physical body. That's how it has been described in political science. So in the old days, you can think as the sovereign, typically portrayed as the body's head, and then you have the analogy that is extended to other anatomical parts. So as a metaphor, it sets out the principles of political organizations, the interdependencies of the different body parts of the body politic. So you may have the government, the judiciary, the people, different institutions, and you start thinking, okay, this is the kind of society we have, these are political organizations, this is the body politic, right? And it is what actually led to Hobbes' explanation of the origin of the state as some kind of social contract. So you have these different parts, and we come into some kind of contract. This is what I should be providing. This is what I expect to get back. And, there are clear responsibilities, duties, and tasks for each part of this body, which is the state. Now, at the same time, we should think about a very real, literal body. And this is also political, and this is the body of all of us, and the experience of our bodies in society. And I think that everyone who's not a white male like ourselves has probably had a first-hand experience of how political the body is. And hopefully, white males who may be a bit concerned about, the culture wars and so on would eventually get it. How political the body of women is, it's very clear if you think about what's going on right now in the United States, right? With the reversal of the laws on abortion, how much the female body is being politicized and the rights are taken and so on. So my interest for the last few years has been to start understanding the centrality of the body at the intersection of politics and the psychophysiological underpinnings of our embodied experience, as we were describing before. But first, you need to answer two questions. What is politics and what is the body in that kind of context, right? So politics, you can have very narrow definitions that politics is just governance, is the exertion of power. You can have very broad definitions, like the one given to us by Lethwich, that politics comprises all the activities of cooperation, negotiation, and conflict within and between societies. So all of the kind of things that are important for the production and reproduction of biological and social life. And I prescribed to this broad definition of politics, understanding how politics actually structure social relationships. Now, at the same time, we should think, okay, what is the body and why is the body important from the point of view of politics? And here I always remember a very important phrase by Charlotte Epstein in her book, The Birth of State, where she says that the body is the political object par excellence. It is what the states aim to keep safe and healthy. And it's such a simple message, but it's so important. And if I were to tell you that what is the most important thing about politics is keeping your body safe and healthy. If I were to tell you that in 2017 or in 2019, you would say, yeah, okay, but maybe taxation is more important, maybe, international affairs are more important. But what the pandemic actually documented in very clear ways is that this is indeed the primary responsibility of the state. And the kind of decisions that politicians are asked to make are crucial. Now, of course, the pandemic highlighted that in extreme ways. But I think we should take a step back and start thinking about the importance of the body, as I said, for social experience, eventually for political engagement. Now, we live in bodies that feel increasingly unsafe, and that is the case for the last decade, I would say. You had the financial crisis, and following that, you have this kind of cultural climate of sexual assault, systemic racism, the pressure of gig economy, the crisis of liberal democracy, the rise of populism, and eventually, you have a mega threat for the whole of humanity, which is climate change that actually induces climate anxiety to a lot of people, and you have the pandemic. And all these phenomena are actually creating feelings of vulnerability. And these feelings are literally visceral. And they're visceral in the sense that this emotional experience of vulnerability we have arise from how our visceral organs actually feel, right? But these are also political in the sense that the kind of feelings of vulnerability that we have will also shape or determine what kind of political decisions and behaviors we engage with. Mm-hmm. Now, there's nothing new in that. The people who have talked carefully about the body, about the concept of homeostasis and allostasis, like Cannon and Sherrington, they spoke about the social dimension of the body politic. Cannon introduced the concept of homeostasis, and he said in the last chapter of his book about the wisdom of the body that there is widespread search for the conditions that would diminish the anxieties and distress of the people. And these are not unlike what we think that should be done when your own body is dysregulated. Mm-hmm. You need to provide safety and health. And Sterling, who introduced the concept of allostasis much later in the 20th century, when he reflects back on his career, he says that, I realized that phenomena that I was studying in the lab and the kind of people that I was seeing in suburbs in American cities who may be suffering from strokes were caused by hypertension. But this is a social tension, it's driven by social factors. And his main impetus of understanding allostasis, how the body actually predicts what's going to happen, and you allocate resources to deal with this kind of uncertainties and risks, is social in its basic sense. So both Cannon and Sterling, they point directly to the relation between the body politic and the physiological body. And I think interoception goes at the heart of that. Why? Because interoception is the mechanism by which visceral physiological signals of regulation or dysregulation, of well-being or ill health, are the ones that are being translated, mentalized into feeling states and affect, eventually emotions. And this is what drives our decisions and choices in life. What kind of political leader do I need in order to satisfy these homeostatic needs? In the same way that the caregiver may be very important in shaping the kind of responses you learn, politicians, the social groups we belong to, their power, their capacity to take decisions for human lives are equally important of understanding, what are my needs and desires? What are the kind of needs and desires of my peers? How do we actually learn what needs to be done in order to have the feeling, at least, of safety and health, upon which we can then thrive? So if you like, this is the kind of direction or intellectual trajectory that can actually bring together these two very different ideas of the body politic as a metaphor and the body politic as some kind of literal lived experience. And they do have the interoception and their mentalization at their center.
Wow, thank you. So that trajectory of sort of intellectual understanding, it's nice to hear you sort of saying that that's something we should be driving forward and promoting. It's reminded me of several things there that, GDP was, or probably still is, the main indicator of success or health of a nation, whereas there are some, the New Economics Foundation, and I think even some Indonesian country has got well indicators of well-being as wanting to include them as a measure of how healthy a nation or state is. And it's also when you're talking about the body and maybe a nation or a country or the world, human race as a whole as a body, superorganism, then the free energy principle and, the scale-free kind of way that we look at how we organize cultures is very interesting. And where would, if we're to look inside how we organize in terms of organs and tissues and all those scales of levels of organization, and we kind of have them already in governments and businesses. You have departments that have purposes, so they're kind of like organs. But if the success is just kind of the bottom line or the profit, then that's not necessarily going to look after the whole health and well-being, is it?
No, you're right. And because you mentioned GDP, and I just want to mention two things. 1848, German physician and anthropologist Rudolf Virchow. He was one of the fathers of social medicine. He said that, medicine is a social science and politics nothing but medicine at a larger scale. So, of course, as a politician, you go beyond what a doctor or physician can actually do, but you should start thinking about the people and the citizens in that kind of way. And here's an interesting finding, because you mentioned GDP. There was a major study in The Lancet published a few years ago that spans 170 countries between 1980 and 2016. And what this showed was that the presence of democratic governance in these countries explains more than does the GDP. The variations in mortality for very different reasons: cardiovascular diseases, transport injuries, cancers, cirrhosis, and other diseases. So it's the democratic governance that is quite important for the kind of health and well-being that people of a country would actually experience. And as you said, we should be shifting a little bit of focus from how the GDP is actually estimated, computed, and what does this measure of economic growth actually tell us about how people experience.
Okay, so they looked at the relationship between democratic governance and individual people's health. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
Right. That is really, really interesting.
And the best health outcomes were actually linked to democratic governance rather than to increases in GDP.
Wow.
And there's a very large body of work linking, politics with physical and mental health.
In what ways?
I mean, especially in the last few years of rising populism, there have been many different studies in the US, for example, looking at how political stressors may be linked to worse health outcomes. So, people who experience the political life of a nation is more stressful. They may have a high risk of preterm births, hypertension, more cardiovascular diseases, more depressive and anxiety symptoms, and so on. Other studies have actually documented, in both presidential election rounds in US in 2016 and 2020, you have deterioration in several measures of physical health that can become detectable at the level of the population. Of course, young people, those who are more politically engaged and perhaps more on the political left, they tend to report more negative affects. There are some estimates that a very large number of the American population may be actually experiencing adverse health symptoms as a response to the political situation. And they're fascinating findings. And, I really want to sit down and put all these together. There was another study that came out, I think, a week or two ago, where they looked, for example, at how extreme temperatures, higher or lower, may actually influence or correlate with the expression of hate speech in social media. And what they actually found is that extreme temperatures, either very warm or very cold, result in an increase in hate speech in Twitter. For me, that's fascinating because extreme temperatures on the planet document a dysregulation, but it also impacts, the regulation of one's own body. And, this is the kind of allostatic load we're talking about. And this has, a behavioral expression that is antisocial, like the rise in hate speech. And I found this fascinating, how these levels of equilibrium, these levels of availability and safety and health, when they are affected, what kind of sociopolitical consequences are actually being generated.
And how they can be self-reinforcing as well. So, if the if the political, if there's political tension and people are feeling stressed because of that, but then their voting decisions or their what they put on social media may change, then that will feed back up to, so it can create a vicious circle or a virtuous cycle. That gives a whole new view of things. You mentioned also in one of the papers on brain-heart dialogue that maybe some biases that we may not be fully aware of, such as racism, can hijack our perceptions as well. So I'm using racism as an example here, but I guess there could be other biases that that you think that some more radical forms of physiological retraining could be required to bring our sort of embodied realities in line with the beliefs we have. So bearing in mind that what you just said about, all this, the complex ways that climate and political sort of messaging and media interact, what forms might these radical forms of physiological retraining be?
Yes, that's a good question. And I'll probably be a bit pessimistic when it comes to physiological retraining is concerned. Because over the years, we've done a lot of studies in my lab looking at questions that have to do with intergroup relations, racism, the expression of racial stereotypes and prejudice. And, whatever we study in the lab is is fine because it's under controlled conditions and we can gain some insights. Like, for example, the study you alluded to, where we showed that basically at times of heightened physiological arousal, white participants, for example, are more likely to misperceive the objects that Black individuals are holding. Even though Black individuals may be holding, a neutral object, the white participants may start seeing that they're holding a gun. This is, of course, all done in computers and not in real life, but it resembles a lot of what we know that is happening on the ground in the US, where Black Americans are twice as likely to be shot while they're unarmed as compared to white individuals. Now, our findings suggest that the kind of priors that people have, the kind of predictions, social predictions that we have, because we live in a society that it is structurally racist, and there are stereotypes that associate different races with different social behaviors. In that particular case, the associations between Black individuals being more dangerous or threatening, because we live in a society where these stereotypes and prejudices are well consolidated. Our brain is using this kind of predictions to detect what is out there, to impose on our perception our prediction that seeing, a dark colored individual in a dark alley, they're more likely to be carrying a gun than a tool. Now, I don't think that there is much to be done in terms of physiological retraining to change this kind of expression of prejudice, because the first point is dealing with the origin of the prejudice to begin with. And that is a social problem. This is not a problem for the lab. It's not a problem for physiologists or neuroscientists. I think what needs to be done is take these insights, understand the importance that stereotypes, jokes, prejudice become ingrained in a culture, that people start, once they're exposed to this, then these become priors and they become predictions, that they have a lot of power in shaping the perception of the reality out there. So I think the question is, how do you bring people together? How you allow people of different backgrounds, different skin colors, different socioeconomic statuses to actually share experience and learn from each other and understand the similarities rather than the differences between them. And then how, probably in education, we start being a bit more critically related to feelings and emotions. A lot of people think about critical thinking as one important skill that people should actually learn and develop. But there's another equally important skill, which is that of critical feeling. So being able to feel, first of all, which is not a given. I think it takes time and effort to be capable of feeling, and then to be capable of reflecting on your feelings and becoming aware of them and understanding their origin. In the same way that when we're starting our discussion, we're saying, babies don't know exactly why they're crying, and they have to rely on somebody else to figure that out for them and give them the right kind of stimulus so they can get the right kind of model about their own bodies. You can also think about the role that individual social groups, politicians, policymakers should be playing in enabling people to make an accurate inference of the social emotions. Why I'm feeling anxious or threatened as a white male in the US today? That's an interesting question. And, politicians who are a bit populist, they will just point the finger to the immigrants or to Black people or to woke culture or to whatever you want. And there is a question for me that's quite important. It's what people actually feel, to what extent their feelings or emotions are prescribed by others. And how do you actually enable people to make the right social inference that, the world is changing and the world is uncertain, but it's not uncertain because, there are few immigrants crossing the channel on a dinghy boat today. There are many other different conditions that come into play. And I think we should all be reflecting both on the causes of these conditions, the socio-political history of these events, and knowledge about the history of these events, and how these events make people feel, and how, given specific feelings, they are more likely to behave in such and such way.
Amazing. Yeah. That idea of critical feeling is, I think that's gonna be my new favorite phrase for the next few weeks. And yeah, that, so that being a way forward for education to for people to say, okay, before I act, let's think about what I'm feeling and try to understand the reasons why I'm feeling that way, rather than just jumping to a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you so much. So are there any other things you'd like to share about visceral politics? Maybe some of the challenges or opportunities you think for the future, other than what you've said, and where can people find out more about your work?
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion, which I really enjoyed. And you've posed some really excellent, intriguing, difficult questions, and I'm not sure I had the answer to all of them, but at least let's say that we find some, pointers for the future. People can follow our work on Twitter, or by following me or the Center for the Politics of Feelings, or our web pages. I think probably for the more up-to-date developments, Twitter would be the best way to actually stay in touch. And I think, just one final thing, that we're trying to create this intellectual space at the Center for the Politics of Feelings, where we bring together people from different disciplines to try and explore these questions. And these are difficult questions, they're not easy answers. But I think they're important insofar we can say something about the ways in which the world makes us feel the way we feel nowadays. And I think there are many different types of uncertainties in the near future that will dominate the experience of large parts of our societies and of people, and how we learn to deal with this kind of uncertainty. In visceral politics, it's not just this kind of negative thing that, we're all outraged about what's going on. There's another sense in which visceral politics can be thought of, which is, having a political organization, political relationships, social relations that make people feel safe to begin with. And then once you feel safe, we're more likely to be able to actually explore the potential that it's out there and deal with uncertainty.
So setting a kind of direction of where we want to how we want to feel viscerally. We want to feel safe in either our personal body or our nation's kind of body politic, for that to feel safe. I really like that. And it's clear that you care deeply about these issues. And so thank you very much for bringing them to this discussion. And I'll include links to the Twitter and your website on the description for this video.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Manos. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Please remember to subscribe to the In a Sense channel for more information about the role of your bodily sensations and tips for using bodily awareness to improve your well-being.